This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Institute of Transportation Engineers, Australia and New Zealand section August webinar. The topic for today's webinar is accessibility-oriented planning and how to make the switch. My name is Mariana Richards. I'm ITE-ANZ board member. I'm also a town planner. I'm not a traffic engineer, for which I humbly apologise. But as we are supposed to be integrating transport and land use planning, I actually have a very keen interest in the topic today. As have, I believe, upwards of 180 registrants, and already we're running in the mid-30s, so no doubt more people will join as we progress. I'll first of all commence with the acknowledgement of country, welcome to country. And so we, the ITE-ANZ, acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants and the traditional custodians of the land where we live, learn and work. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we also acknowledge the Treaty of Waitangi and the Maori as the original people of Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand. We acknowledge any people of Indigenous descent who are with us today. Just some quick housekeeping before we head into our presentations. Please remain on mute, and there will be plenty of chances for question and discussion at the end of the presentations, but you may enter any questions that you would like through the chat facility, and please do that at any time, and I'll try and monitor them as we go through. The speakers today are Professor David Levinson from the University of Sydney and Dr. Laura Aston, a recent PhD graduate from Monash University. I'll tell a little bit more about each of them prior to their presentations. However, accessibility is not a new measure of transport system performance. It's certainly been around for more than 6 decades. And I can remember my own father talking about this sort of thing when he was working on the Melbourne Transportation Study in the 1960s. So that would be about the right time. I suppose the need for updating our transport system performance measurements has been garnered a bit of attention lately, not only because of the need to address equity and sustainability in transport, but also the increased availability of data and software to measure it. The Transport Access Manual has been developed to demystify access management, although I'm sure at over 200 pages, it's not exactly light reading, but I did attempt to read it. Today, David and Laura will discuss the essential elements of access management, which is probably just as well, because when I'm having a look at the contributing authors, there are academics from not only Australia, but also Canada, the United States, UK, Israel, France, the Netherlands, and Portugal. There are also contributions from various research and institutes, perhaps some aligned with universities but sitting separately. Some contributions from municipalities in North America, as well as the private sector. The first speaker today will be Professor David Levinson, who, as I mentioned earlier, teaches in the School of Civil Engineering at the University of Sydney, where he leads the Transport Lab and the Transport Engineering Research Group. He also directs the Master of Transport program. His most recent research emphasises transport and land use interactions, accessibility, and transport systems evolution. He has a long and distinguished professional and academic career going back into the mid-1990s. From what I can gather, he's widely published, and if you read his blogs on LinkedIn, they are extensive, and no doubt his blogs elsewhere are equally as extensive. Please sit back and enjoy David's presentation.
Okay, thank you. All right, so this is a two-part presentation. I'm going to talk about a general theory of access, and Laura is going to talk more about the Transport Access Manual in part 2. Overall, it's about accessibility-oriented planning, why and how to make the switch. And so I'll begin with a question: why are we here? And perhaps more mundanely, why might we be here? Which, if this were normal times, I'd be in the civil engineering building, but in practice, we're all online. So why are we here today? I'm here because you're here. Wouldn't make a lot of sense for me to be giving a presentation about accessibility or anything else if there was no audience to hear it. And you're here because I am here, and Laura is here, and others are here, because there's not a lot of point listening to a webinar unless there's somebody presenting. And why at the ITE-ANZ seminar? To be able to access the best transport researchers and practitioners in the world. So we're talking about accessibility, and give a brief background on theory. So talk about what I call a general theory of access. And the idea is that the only reason to locate anywhere is to be near some things. Okay, for instance, other people you're having a conversation with, your job, opportunities that you might want to go to in normal times, being able to go to restaurants. If you're in a supermarket, being near the goods that you want to pick up. To be far from other things, we call them disamenities. We might think of them as, quarantine centers that you want to be as far from as possible, rather than locating them in the middle of central business districts. And to possess things, because you can possess the physical things that you're at. If you're on a farm, you can raise crops, or you can manage large animals, and so on. So accessibility is about measuring the reason we locate places, and it's about how close you are, how far you are to various things. So the question is, what do people care about? And they care about a variety of things: jobs, stores, shops, and so on. And we observe that people will pay a premium to be in areas that give them the accessibility to things that they care about, and allow them to save time to places that they're going to go. And as a consequence, those people are more productive when they're nearer things that are valuable. And what we want to do is we want to measure the access to all the things that people care about, and that requires measuring the cost of travel to reach those things. So that's the concept, that's the theory underlying this. Empirically, we know that accessibility explains people's commute times. People who live in areas with higher access to jobs and lower access to competing workers have shorter commutes. We know that accessibility explains mode shares. Places with relatively high mode share, with relatively high transit access to jobs compared with auto access to jobs, have a higher transit mode share, and vice versa. It explains real estate prices and density. Places that are more accessible are more expensive, and just look at the difference in prices in a central business district compared to the outback. The reason is not because of the views in the central business district. It's not because the property in the central business district has more mineral resources underneath the land. It's because it has greater access to other people. It explains incomes and productivity. Places with higher access are more productive, and the people who work there earn higher incomes. And it explains transport investment decisions historically. in a study that we did of the London Underground, the rail lines that provided higher accessibility, the proposed rail lines that provided higher accessibility were more likely to be built, and the rail lines that provided lower accessibility were forgotten. So how do we measure this? So conceptually, we can think about it as, imagine you're at the white circle in the center and there are 4 potential opportunities. And we can draw a circle that's a 10-minute radius from where you are. And we can see that in a 10-minute radius from the white circle, you can't reach any of the red dots. So you have 0 opportunities you can reach. In 20 minutes, you can reach 2 of the red dots. You have 2 opportunities. So within a 20-minute upper bound, your accessibility is 2. And within a 30-minute upper bound travel time, your accessibility is 3. This is what we call a cumulative opportunities or primal access measure. So we can similarly look at it the other way around. Same map, same 10 minutes and 20-minute and 30-minute circles. But in this case, we're looking at, instead of how many red dots you can reach in a given time, we're looking at how much time does it take to reach a given number of red dots. So in this case, it takes 14 minutes to reach 2 red dots. So we would say that our dual access to 2 opportunities is 14 minutes. And it takes 23 minutes to reach 3 red dots. So if you might be interested in how long does it take to reach 3 grocery stores? That would be a dual type of measure. Or how long does it take to reach the nearest hospital? And we have dual measures embedded in a lot of our planning and policy standards. We can think about it from the point of view of firefighting. How long does it take to get to your house from the fire station? And we might have a standard which says that everybody should be who lives in the city should be within a 10-minute trip from the fire station to your house. So that would be a dual access measure. You can be reached by 1 fire station within 10 minutes. I'm going to focus on the cumulative opportunities measure in this part of the presentation. It's a very useful measure. There are, of course, more complicated measures, and we can talk about those. But the advantage of cumulative opportunities, it's a simple count of destinations reachable within a threshold. Okay, so it's not an index. It's not some conceptual number. It's an actual thing that you could go out and count. And our primal measure says we're looking at a 30-minute accessibility to 10,000 jobs. Okay, and we can call this an opportunity denominated measure because we're looking at the number of minutes required to reach 10,000 jobs. We could, if we drew a 30-minute circle, counted the number of jobs, and it was 10,000, it's a primal measure. We can look at similarly the dual measure that would say that we can reach 10,000 jobs within 30 minutes, and that's time denominated, and it's the time to reach a fixed number of opportunities. And the question, of course, is what metrics are we looking at? What time thresholds are we looking at? What opportunities are we looking at? And so on. So this measure, okay, this is an engineering presentation. We can allow ourselves some equations. The primal measure is given by this equation, which isn't exactly what Hansen wrote in 1959, but it's basically what he meant. And it basically says the accessibility cumulative opportunities measure at I is equal to the sum of all other destinations of the opportunities at that destination multiplied by some function of the travel time or travel cost, Cij. Okay. We operationalize this typically with opportunities being jobs and our travel cost being travel time, but we can use any kind of opportunities and any kind of costs when measuring an accessibility measure. The reason we focus on jobs is jobs have historically been the most important trip that a large percentage of the population makes, though we have to recognize that about only half the population is actually in the workforce. So it's certainly not the only trip that people make, and half of the people don't go to work at all. So you might want to look at schools. You might want to look at other public services. You might want to look at restaurants. You might want to look at wilderness areas and so on, airports, museums. And cost. Travel time is a straightforward cost from the transport perspective. We, of course, put travel time as the most important cost. But we can think of out-of-pocket costs, which might include things like paying tolls on motorways or paying fares on public transit. And we might actually think about this, if we're looking at this from a public sector point of view, social costs included as well. So externalities like pollution and crash costs and noise externalities and carbon emissions could also be costs that you consider when estimating accessibility, particularly if you want to compare alternatives. One alternative might have a faster travel time and be better for the individual, but another one might have lower externalities and thus be better off for society as a whole. That's the kind of analysis that you can do in this framework. So Waldo Tobler, a famous transport geographer, said, everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. So when we're looking at our function of cost, if we're using a simple cumulative opportunities measure, we could basically think of this as a staircase type function, which just takes the value of 1 if the cost is within a particular range and 0 otherwise. Okay, so might take 1 if the cost is less than 30 minutes and 0 otherwise, and we all count all the jobs that are within 30 minutes. You could similarly look at the jobs that are between 20 and 30 minutes, and then look at the access of jobs that are 20 to 30 minutes away, and separately look at jobs that are 30 to 40 minutes away if you wanted to. We might think that we should look at something that's more continuous, and we haven't developed, but it's long been available, a time-weighted cumulative opportunity measure. And the idea is that you're measuring the cost to every particular destination and weighting that destination by some distance decay function, which gives you a higher weight to things that are closer and a lower weight to things that are farther away. And the implication of this is you're looking at the equivalent number of opportunities that are at your doorstep. So opportunities that are at your doorstep have a weight of 1, and ones that are farther away have a lower weight, and you would sum them all up ultimately. Now, the measure that I said, we can expand it, right? So that basically was just a simplified version of what I'm about to present. So what we're measuring at some point in time, the access at location I for time of day H by activity type Z by mode M, considering cost category C within some time threshold T for persons in a particular group. And we're saying that that equals the sum of opportunities at location J at time of day H for some activity type Z multiplied by some function of the cost from getting from I to J at time H by mode M considering cost category C. Okay, that's just an expanded version of that, which is very specific because, as we know, travel times vary by time of day. So the travel time in rush hour is going to be different than the travel time outside of rush hour. The opportunities that we're looking at don't have to be jobs. They could be something else. And so you get a different access measure if you're looking at a different type of opportunity. The travel times and travel costs vary by mode, and as well as people's willingness to travel. And the cost categories you consider, whether you're considering just travel time or you're considering travel time and money, also varies. And different people are exposed to different sets of opportunities. So people who, not just who live in one area, might be exposed to one set of opportunities. We might want to look at people divided by different age groups because they're collectively exposed to different sets of opportunities. And it might be important that children are near schools and less important that the elderly are near schools and more important that the elderly are near other types of facilities. So measuring this by subpopulations can often be very useful. And we might be very specific and we say that it's the accessibility at time of day 8 a.m. for mode walking, considering measured travel time within 30 minutes and access to jobs and that are within 30 minutes at that time of day. Okay, so again, labeling each of these particular subscripts, giving it a physical meaning, something that we can go out in the real world and count. Now we've done this for Sydney, and what we've got right here is a map of Sydney, which is showing our accessibility by walking, by biking, by public transport, and by driving. In this case, the access within 30 minutes for each of these, and you can see a heat map basically. And as you can see, that you can get to more destinations by driving than you can get by walking within the same amount of time, which isn't surprising. Cars are typically faster than people walking. And we can compare the ratios of the access to jobs versus access to workers, or the access by public transport to the access by automobile. In this case, looking at the ratio of jobs to workers, there's more jobs in the center part of Sydney and fewer workers there. And conversely, as you'd expect, there are more workers around the suburban edges of Sydney and fewer jobs in those locations. So we can understand why there are tidal flows of people who are going from one area to another in the morning on a typical commute, because the workers live in the west and the jobs tend to be in the east. So there's going to be more flows in one direction than in the other. So we were being specific before. To be general, we'd want to do this for all categories, right? So your overall access, the access that decides where you actually choose to locate, where you might buy a home, or where you physically want to stand at a given time, depends on your access to all the things that you care about in the future. Okay, now that requires that we need to weight all of our opportunities for given different types of activities by some weight. So each activity has a particular weight associated with it. Jobs might be more important than access to shops or access to schools or access to hospitals, but it's not like we don't want access to all of those things. We might want to weight by time of day. The access at 8 a.m. is important if you're traveling at 8 a.m., but the access at 9 a.m. is important for people traveling at 9 a.m. And you care about access at different times of day. You care about access for the modes that you're going to use. You care less about access for the modes you're not going to use. So we might want to wait for modal availability. If you don't own a car, access by automobile isn't that important to you. And we might want to weight by the population in each of the subgroups as we add this up. Now, that's a clunky notation, so we can summarize this and say that the matrix of full accessibilities, bold A sub I, is equal to our matrix of sum of the matrix of our full set of opportunities multiplied by a full set of costs. Okay. Now, you can compare this with the original Hansen equation, and this is what we would like to be able to do. And it's the difference of what we would like to measure and what we can measure. So when we talk about access to jobs, the maps that I showed you, for instance, the number of jobs you can reach within 30 minutes, that's something that we can measure now. Measuring access to everything, that's more difficult because we have to define all the different categories of places you might want to visit. We can identify some of them, certainly. All of them is a bit of a stretch. And then we have to figure out how to weight them, and that's even a little bit more difficult. So our theory is that access properly measured explains everything. And in theory, we can construct a measure that looks at access by activity, person and place, by time of day, by mode, considering all of our costs and everyone's unique preferences. In a sense, this is what utility measures try to do if we think about from transport planning models and the mode choice models that are often utility based. Now, in practice, we construct measures of access to jobs in a few other places, typically in the peak, sometimes in the off-peak, by the modes that we care about most, automobile and public transport and walking and biking, considering actual measured travel times, okay, as opposed to people's perceived travel times, for an average person or for selected groups. Now, the good thing is that the practical measure correlates reasonably well with our theoretical ideal in that it explains people's behaviors reasonably well, but there's always a residual, a difference between a perfect fit and what the statistical fit that we get in an actual model. So this is what we're thinking about and talking about when we're talking about access. I guess I'll save the questions for after the second part. And Laura is now going to talk about the Transport Access Manual. So I will turn it over to her. If I can figure out how to do that.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Laura Aston is very well known to ITE-ANZ members. She's a past member of the ITE-ANZ board, and has been a driving force behind the establishing the Young ITE group and the Student Leadership Summit program. She was the Traffic Works Undergraduate Student Award in 2015. She participated in the Austraffic Worldwide Learning Opportunities Biennial Conference at the University of Minnesota, and a Student Leadership Summit there as well in 2018, and has twice received the President's Award for Excellence in 2017 2018. Laura is a sustainable transport professional with expertise and experience across research, government and consulting. She's contributed to projects which aim to increase access by active public transport modes through urban design and land use integration. Laura holds a PhD from Monash University for research work in exploring the link between the built environment and public transport use. Please enjoy Laura's presentation.
I lost my audio there and camera, but I'm coming back, so just bear with me. I'm not quite sure what happened there. So let's take two. I think we're right. Thanks for the introduction, Mariana. It's been a pleasure being involved with the ITE, both in Australia and internationally, over 5 or 6 years. And I'm also grateful to yourself, Mariana, as well as David, Ben Thompson, Danielle Rebecci, and other board members who have made today's event possible, and all the webinars that the ITE-ANZ put on, because they are a lot of work and it takes a dedicated crew to bring the speakers together and put these events on. So thank you very much, guys. Just another acknowledgement I'd like to make before I get started today, and that is to the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people on whose beautiful land I'm lucky to spend most of my time living and working. Now, you've heard David discuss a body of knowledge about access, including a theory of access, and also getting into some of the calculations that you might use to measure access. So I might characterize that as the how of measuring access in planning. I'm going to take you through some practical steps so that you can implement an access measurement. And this is essentially what is set out in the Transport Access Manual. That's the goal of the Transport Access Manual, which I'm giving you an overview of today. An accessibility-oriented approach to planning focuses on the ability of people and goods to reach or be reached by opportunities. You can read an abridged overview of the Transport Access Manual in this article, which shares its title with today's presentation, and is published in the current edition of the ITE Journal, which is also dedicated to active transport. For me, a critical aspect of using access as a performance measure for transport is that it puts people at the centre, and it demonstrates the importance of integrating land use with a variety of modes. Because if that integration across modes is not there, you'll notice that your accessibility drops away. And that's what I mean when I say it highlights the importance of integrating land use with all sorts of modes. Now, this is just a warning to you that in a sec, I'm going to run a poll. So if you can open a web browser or get your phone out and download the Slido app or open the Slido website. And in a moment, I'll share some polls on the screen. Before I do get to that though, I just want to make a final acknowledgement to the dozens of contributors that Mariana alluded to at the start, the contributors to the Transport Access Manual. David Levinson and David King brought this group of researchers and practitioners together over some in-person conferences, back when that was a thing, at the start of 2020, and also virtually from North and South America, Europe and Australia, to publish a truly valuable open access manual for measuring access, or as the subtitle says, the connection between people and places. I enjoyed learning from this group, whose collective knowledge I get to share with you today. Okay, to the polls. I'm keen to get a sense of our audience and your adoption of access in planning. So my question to you is, in what situations do you apply access measures in your work? And if you all know how to use a QR code, so hover away or join at the Slido.com website with the code that's displayed on the screen. Looks like folks are intently looking at their screens. Oh, there we go. Okay, great. Results are coming in. So we're seeing lots of people who use it to benchmark the existing conditions, understand what's there. That's great. But it seems that's on a tie or with people who don't use it in their work, and that's also fine. I was just wanting to gauge it. Things are moving around fast. We've also got a lot of people using it to monitor changes. I think that goes hand in hand with benchmarking. Appraise project options. That's really great. So we're seeing people using it in decision making to actually identify and prioritize different project options. Then there's the evaluation stage of projects. Great to see people using it for that. And probably not surprisingly, the least used is for cost-benefit ratios. And I have a sense that that might be because it's not been widely adopted or given the sort of legitimacy of other measures that might be currently recognised for doing that kind of accounting on projects. Now, that was a great response. Thanks to the 45 people at least who responded to that. I have one more, so stay on the app. I'd also like to gauge your level of comfort in using access measures. Do you feel like you know where to turn for authoritative guidance? Do you feel like you have a mandate to include access in your decision making? So that's giving me a great sense. Some people feel like they do have the adequate guidance and the mandate, but the majority of people feel that there's inadequate guidance, and hopefully through this presentation we can point you in the direction of resources that might come in handy there and start building towards, I guess, giving accessibility more legitimacy in decision making in our projects. And why I was interested in that was because, it gives me a sense of which aspects of the Transport Access Manual will be particularly valuable to today's audience. Here's a peek inside the Transport Access Manual, which is an open access resource, so you can find it by Googling, and at the end of today's presentation I've also got a QR code that will link directly to the website where you can download it for free, or if you like to have a copy on your shelf, you can also order a paperback, although you do have to pay for that. Mariana said it was a bit dense. Okay, fair enough. I think it's quite accessible. Oh, there you go, I've used the word. It's quite, I think it's quite readable for most audiences, and it contains a variety of perspectives, not only engineers, but people working to develop policy, people from social sciences. So it's a variety of perspectives that went into putting this manual together. And I think it's got something for everyone, from, programming scripts to high-level concepts, why you might use access, to communicate and things like that. In this presentation, I'll be mirroring the article in the ITE journal, and I'll take you on a bit of a tour on a few of the essential elements of access measurement. So Firstly, what is access and what distinguishes it from other measures of transport system performance? Well, in transport engineering, we might be primarily concerned with flow and speed measures. In land use planning, we tend to be interested in the distribution of land uses, which in turn affect the distances and routes available to travel. Access or accessibility, which I use interchangeably, and so does the manual, combines both of these to instead measure the ease and availability of connections between people and places. So it's just changing the emphasis on what we're using as a performance measure. Therefore, access accounts for both travel costs and opportunities, and costs may be influenced by mode, and that's really nicely captured in this illustration that was put together by Sylvia Tong at the time she was working at Movement and Place Consulting to depict how you might be able to reach destinations in differing amounts of time depending on the mode that you use. So those journeys may become easier or faster, same thing depending which mode you use, and that may put some destinations within reach. So access metrics have applications in many fields, and David also touched on this. This is because good access increases the viability and the value of a range of different goods and services. And the reverse is also true. Poor access can be detrimental to many industries. So other sectors beyond transport that may find access measurements useful include land use planning, real estate pricing or development, and productivity and employment sectors. We touched on some of the uses of access measures in the survey, and I was interested there particularly in how we might use it for decision making. But going beyond strictly decision making, accessibility is useful for identifying areas that may be in need of improvement. In that way, it's useful as a tool to understand equity issues that may be underlying in society. It can be used to set performance standards, to test scenarios, and evaluate land development potential. For more on the role of access measures, appendices A about consequences and B planning in the Transport Access Manual provide some more discussion around this. I'd just like to draw out a couple of examples, and I'll hark back to the one that David gave about access in fire emergencies. So the US National Fire Protection Association has an emergency response standard. It stipulates that travel time will be less than 4 minutes for 90% of fire and medical emergency incidences. Now, that's a standard, but to plan to meet this standard, it would be useful to explore a measure of access, and that is what proportion of the population currently lives within 4 minutes of the response locations. Now, only by firstly establishing the baseline can you then identify how close or far away you are from achieving that performance standards, and then to identify where you need to intervene to make that standard achievable. So another example is the 20 or 30-minute neighbourhood concept, which is a planning paradigm here in Melbourne and also in Sydney and other parts of Australia and New Zealand we're quite familiar with. And it revolves around targets for the type and opportunities available to people within, as the name suggests, 20 or 30 minutes, or depending on which city you live, maybe 10 or 15 if you live in Paris. And this applies to different modes of transport as well. Now, the English Indices of Multiple Deprivation measures several domains that are concerned with the ability to participate in society or access key services such as housing, education, healthcare, and employment. Now, not all of the indices of deprivation are strictly about access, but some of them are. Now, this is a great example of monitoring and using access measures over time to identify equity issues and then justify and tailor policy interventions. In fact, the UK government has been collecting this data since 1970, so hats off to the UK government. Now, David introduced earlier some of the measures, including how you might calculate these. So consider this just a refresh and perhaps a step back. I'm thinking about it from a high level. As we discussed earlier, access measures combine travel costs, which are the transport network features, with opportunities, which are the land use characteristics that describe constraints, needs, abilities, and opportunities available to individuals. Measures can be thought of in two distinct ways. There are those that are opportunity-based, which we can also call primal measures, and these focus on the number of opportunities that can be reached in a given time or cost. For example, a primal measure might seek to understand the number of jobs reachable within 30 minutes by automobile at 8 a.m. So another type of access measure is a time or cost-based measure, also called a dual measure. These are interested in the time taken or the distance or some other unit of cost to reach or be reached by a given opportunity or a certain number of opportunities. To give you an example, we might measure the travel time required to reach the nearest hospital emergency room. Now, here I'm outlining measures. It's just worth noting that measures and standards are two different things. Measures tell you what is there. Standards convey what should be there. And standards need to be decided by, consultation between stakeholders, not just measuring what's available. Now, I just wanted to draw out the different kinds of measures with some examples so we can sort of understand the distinction. In this first figure, I've captured a primal measure of access, and that's access to primary schools, a count of how many primary schools are accessible within 20 minutes in the local government area of Brimbank, which happens to be where I live, in Melbourne, by 3 modes of transport. Clearly from the figure we can see that there's a relative advantage gained by automobile. You can access hundreds of primary schools driving. Interestingly, although the north and southeastern zones convey poor accessibility for walkers and cyclists, this limitation is overcome in cars. So I'm talking about the bottom right-hand corner, the southeast corner of Brimbank, where accessibility is poor for walking and cycling, but it's very good for cars. And this may reflect that there is a higher density of primary schools to the east that are only reachable by automobile. That's the kind of insight we can gain from using this measure. In the next figure, we've instead looked at how many minutes it takes to access 3 primary schools. Now, a question I'd put to what I might seek to understand from this is the access afforded by each mode adequate? I mean, it depends how you define adequate. Obviously, most people only need to go to 1 primary school, but it might be desirable to have a choice of at least 3. If we look at the cycling map, we see that almost half of people can reach 3 primary schools within a 10-minute bike ride, and most can reach 3 within 20 minutes, but this is not the case for walking. Now, elaborating a little bit further on access measures, if we think of the perspective or what we're actually measuring, there can be 4 types of metrics: infrastructure-based, which look at the topology and may use network or graph-based measures; location-based, which quantify opportunities available from the trip origin or to the trip destination. This includes the weighted cumulative opportunities measure that David touched on. We might think of access in terms of utility-based measures, where individuals seek to maximise the utility or minimise the cost of participating in a trip. And there are also person-based measures which specifically talk about access in reference to the individual, and it quantifies the opportunities available at the level of the individual. For specific measures, refer to Chapter 4 in the Transport Access Manual, and also in the appendices, you'll see some more examples of the different types of metrics that fall under each of these. To an important consideration, and that is of biases. Obviously, there are trade-offs inherent with making any kind of measurement, and this reminds me of the warning that often accompanies transport models, where you have to make assumptions and choose the measure that's most appropriate depending on the application. There are a few key biases to be wary of in measuring access. One is that the way that you define the cost requires some subjective judgment and may not be uniform for all people. I mean, think of the different capabilities that people might have that would therefore require some distinction, but often when we apply an access measure, that is not factored in. So obviously the choice of impedance adds weights that include some underlying assumptions about what people value in travelling around. There are also cutoff effects, otherwise known as edge effects, that come with using distance thresholds and time windows. So if we decide that a suitable cycling catchment is 5 kilometres, what happens to the stores that are just beyond that 5 kilometre threshold? And what about the value of the stores that are within 1 kilometre compared to 5? Now, there are certain ways of measuring that can add appropriate weights, but it's just worth being conscious of that edge effect if you are applying hard thresholds like that. And again, with time windows, we might be interested to understand peak behaviour, but then you have to be careful about how you're defining the peak. If you're looking at accessibility by public transport between 7:30 a.m. and 8:30 a.m., what about the bus that departs at 7:29? We know in reality someone might be willing to adjust their schedule to catch that bus, but in our calculation we don't actually see it. And finally, there's a trade-off between the size of the dataset or the granularity of the dataset and the ability to compute and also generalize or develop precise measures. There's always a trade-off there. Couple of things to keep in mind. More nuanced measures need more data. The more complicated your metric, the more difficult it is to convey its meaning. And so there's a fine balance to be struck there. And finally, quantitative measures, which are primarily the focus of the Transport Access Manual, they provide a guide for the quantitative measurement of access, most of which is geared towards network-wide evaluation. These are useful for identifying broad trends, but are no substitute for consultative and user-centered approaches to understand the contextual barriers to access and develop tailored strategies. So just briefly touching on the 5 key data inputs that you might need to measure accessibility. The first one is about people. Where are people residing? Where do they work? The second is places. Where are the opportunities located? What are the sorts of points of interest that we're interested in including as our opportunities? Movement. So how do people move around? What routes are available? Time, how long is the duration? And costs. And that David touched on a range of different costs that might be included in your function. Now, we're lucky these days to have a lot and a growing amount of open data. In Victoria and New South Wales, there are data portals where you can download all of this information. I haven't actually included it here, but the ABS is another great source. But as well, there are open source platforms that have up-to-the-minute data such as GTFS, so public transport schedules, as well as ever-growing maps of different opportunities. So OpenStreetMap is a good source for points of interest, as is Auran, which brings together lots of government and other endorsed data sets. And more we see that computer programs such as Python have the ability to pull in this data automatically. Now, there are lots of tools that might seem very overwhelming, and I expect that most people in the audience will not necessarily have a degree in computer science, and so that seems very daunting. Well, the good news is that there are many off-the-shelf tools available, as well as many scenario-focused planning software. I guess the trade-off with off-the-shelf tools, what I mean by that is you may find reports or data sets that have already calculated levels of accessibility for a particular area. The tools collated in TAM primarily focus on the North American context, but I've just highlighted two that relate to Australia. So we've got the Access Across Australia and New Zealand reports. David mentioned it briefly, and I'll show you some more figures in a moment. And as well, the Australian Urban Observatory has sub-indicators that relate to accessibility, and these are person-based measures that are developed for many of the cities in Australia. As well, you might be interested in planning tools that don't come with that limitation that, you know, what you see is what you get. You can actually open it up and tailor it to your situation, your context, and it does the calculations for you. And of course, there's a list there which you'll also find in the Transport Access Manual. I mentioned the Access Across Australia report written by Hao Wu and David Levinson. Hello, Hao, I saw you're in the audience. Well done, great work. And here is just one example of what it conveys for 8 cities in Australia. It measured the opportunities reachable within travel time thresholds by car, transit, bicycle, and walking. And what we see here is a graph showing the ratio of jobs reachable by transit compared to automobile. And what it conveys is that across Australian cities, the automobile has a significant advantage. In fact, on average, public transport only allows access to 12 to 18% of the opportunities that you could otherwise reach by car. The report, and David, pipe in here or maybe at the end if I've misrepresented anything, but just a few key findings from this report to demonstrate what you can see from an access measure. The report says that Melbourne and Sydney had the highest accessibility, measured again as the number of opportunities that are reachable, and there are distinct advantages to city centres. Interestingly, the 30-minute cycling accessibility in Australia's cities tended to be higher than what it was for public transport. The situation is fairly similar in New Zealand. The automobile enjoys a relative advantage compared to other modes. But in Wellington, it's a bit more competitive for public transport. And in Wellington, 38% of the opportunities that can be reached by car can also be reached by public transport. Wellington also has the highest walk accessibility of the 3 cities that were studied, which were Christchurch, Auckland, and Wellington. And again, the trend with cycling is seen, again, with up to 3 times more accessibility conveyed by bicycle than by public transport. And in this figure, I'm just showing a comparison of the destinations, or sorry, the jobs that can be reached by transit compared to bicycling in Auckland. Another tool to mention, just to give you a flavour of the scope of what's out there, this is the London WebCat mapping system, which uses PTAL, public transport accessibility level, and displays access to and from transit in London within a given travel time. Now that just about brings me to the end, but I wanted to leave with some parting motivation. Why implement an access measure? There are a range of reasons to enhance your knowledge of the problem, the policy problem. So to, as I mentioned at the start, to flesh out the equity issues, to understand what can and can't be reached by different spatially across the population. It promotes systems thinking and interdisciplinary collaboration, and that's because we're thinking about a range of inputs here rather than simplifying to think about flow or simplifying to think about just land use. We're putting them together to look at the sum of how the transport systems enable actual people to get to actual destinations. Accessibility can facilitate stakeholder engagement. It's also a great communication tool if you're able to produce visual representations and talk about the ability to reach destinations that are important to people. It tends to have more meaning than some of the other measures that we may use for transport system performance. And I guess just finally, harking back to that point about equity and social exclusion, it's a useful measure to identify and quantify different dimensions of this. Now that concludes my presentation, which means I think we are coming to questions. I'll just leave that for a moment to let you use the QR code if you'd like to jump into the Transport Access Manual, but you can also just as easily Google. But thank you all very much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And thank you to our speakers. There are a few questions starting to appear in the chat box, but I'll be a typical town planner and go first. And I suppose one of the issues that occurs to me is perhaps both speakers sort of touched on it, but the using the modelling to inform locational decisions in terms of land use or development. So, and also I think touched on a little bit was the way the model might be applied in conjunction with other tools. And I'd be interested to understand if there are any sort of case studies or examples, particularly David in New South Wales, where the Greater Sydney is going for the 3-city model. Is this sort of modelling been applied in those locations?
Well, implicitly. So if you think about the 3 cities model, it's a metropolis of 3 cities, and they've defined a 30-minute city. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the 30-minute city and the 20-minute neighborhood aren't directly comparable, because the 20-minute neighborhood's talking about a round trip. So it's really, if you in the 30-minute city context, it's really a 10-minute neighborhood rather than a 20-minute neighborhood. But the idea of the 30-minute city, there's several definitions in the plan, but sort of the main one is that people can reach their primary center, one of the three cities in the 3 cities plan, within 30 minutes by public or active transport. Okay, that's an accessibility measure right there. Okay, it's not the accessibility measure I would choose, but that is an accessibility measure, and it's central in the long run plan for Sydney. A second way you might think about this, and we're sort of moving in this direction, is how we're financing government. And we're moving towards a land value tax in New South Wales. And the land value tax basically says that instead of charging people the value of property when they buy it, we charge them a value of the assessed value of the property every year. If initially, once you opt into the system, but ultimately the idea would be it would be mandatory, and that the property value would presumably increase the more accessible that property was, and would increase when accessibility changed. So if a metro station popped up across the street, your land might become more valuable. And that accessibility shows up in your assessed property value, which will then show up in government revenues, which will, one hopes, eventually be included in project evaluation about whether to build metro stations in the first place, and in zoning measures and other types of land use regulation about whether to permit development based on the access and ultimately the government revenue that they will directly generate. So I think there are applications locally. There have been studies about how to use accessibility measures in deciding whether to permit alternative developments or look at alternative plans. In my misguided youth, when I was a transport planner in Montgomery County, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., we had a growth management system which permitted development based on sustainable public facilities. And the criteria for sustainability, the criteria for adequacy of public facilities was the accessibility by public transit. And so the places that had greater accessibility by public transit were allowed to tolerate more congested highways because people had a better set of alternatives available to them. And so those places could get more development permitted. So it's been used for decades on and off in different ways in different places, sometimes more front and center, sometimes more buried in the details. But I think accessibility is a longstanding transport planning tool, and probably making it more obvious would be useful. I don't know if Laura has anything to chip in.
Not specifically an example, but we did have lots of attendees who did say they had used accessibility. So I'd be interested if anyone wants to pipe up. There was also a question in the chat about whether there was instances of local government adopting this measure. So maybe a bit unconventional, but if anyone in the audience is from local government and has implemented an access measure from the survey, we had lots of people that did say they had, then we'd love to hear example.
Yes, so perhaps if anyone who wants to put any examples, pop them in the chat too, and we can pick them up at the end. Michael Kennedy, never one to keep quiet, has raised a very interesting question, but has COVID impacted on the assessment of physical access and a situation of remote versus hybrid work, etc.?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question. We've been doing some work looking at virtual versus physical access in my research lab, and if you think about it, there's different problems for different types of opportunities, right? So if we're thinking about shopping, virtual shopping is you go shopping on your keyboard and stuff gets delivered to you, and you are not making a trip, so the proximity of the shop to you isn't necessarily important for the virtual trip, but the shipper is bringing it to you, so they have a cost, and that cost is somehow embedded in the price of the good. So if you start looking at a full cost and a dual access measure, how much does it cost to acquire this good physically? And that would be the cost of me going to a store, going into the store, buying it, checking out, paying for the good, and then bringing it home. So I've got two one-way trips, time in the store, and the cost of the good, versus the cost of the shipper, Amazon or whoever, delivering it to me, which is the cost of my time on the computer, which is presumably slow, but it's actually not zero. The cost of them pulling the good, putting it on a truck, and sending it on the route, and then delivering it to me, plus the schedule delay that's associated with that, because I don't get the good immediately, but I might get it in 1 hour if I'm in the United States on a good day with Amazon in a good city, or 24 hours or 48 hours, depending on how much you're willing to pay. So you can look at a dual access measure for goods, and that's, I don't want to say straightforward, but it's more straightforward than the second problem, which is looking at virtual access to jobs. And you mentioned remote and hybrid work. So for hybrid work, which presumably means that you go into the office 3 days a week or 2 days a week, that's also relatively straightforward, because we're looking at the travel time. Instead of the daily travel time, we might look at how many jobs can you reach in 60 minutes travel per week, or 90 minutes travel per week, or 120 minutes travel per week. And if you're only going in 1 day a week, then you can live farther away and reach more opportunities. So that's okay. But then if you never go in, then your travel time is zero, and that of course creates some types of mathematical issues potentially. But again, your full cost isn't necessarily zero, because your salary might be different, your housing prices might be different. In fact, they might be cheaper, but you might need to have a dedicated office at home instead of your employer providing one, which would be a positive cost. And you have to pay for bandwidth and those kinds of things. So there's some trade-offs there and some costs there that might show up. Now, it's an open question at this point whether employers will continue to pay the same salary to people who are no longer commuting 5 days a week or commuting at all. And I think there's some difference of opinion as to how that's going to shake out, and time will tell. But I think that's something to keep in mind. So if we look at access more broadly than just the transport cost, but also sort of the cost of engaging in the transaction, then I think the access framework is still useful. Now, in a sense, I can do work anywhere in the world if I'm an office worker, which is good for the 50% of the people who are office workers. And then the other 50% of the people work very much tied to the physical reality of life. And for them, the accessibility types of measures are going to continue to be important metrics on the job front.
Okay, Natalie Gravett queried what measures are used in New Zealand, Australia as distances for walking and cycling mode appraisal. Are there sort of, I guess the question would be, what are there sort of standard metrics for this sort of thing?
I mean, I can talk about walking, but the standard doesn't necessarily reflect the best practice, and this is an evolving conversation. I'll just mention that in the Victorian Planning Scheme, there are development controls that stipulate that within 800 metres of train, 600 metres of tram and 400 metres of bus, there are certain permissions for developing more intensely, because that represents the walkable catchment of public transport, just to use an example. But in reality, we know that people are willing to walk very different distances depending on their capabilities, depending on the type of destination, the terrain. And that's something that I've recently been involved in looking at in the UK context, when looking at how urban design supports healthy lifestyles through active transport. And we took an approach to sort of look at the 80th percentile distances that people walk based on travel survey data. And not only that, but using a weighted function. So I alluded to this when talking about thresholds. If you use a hard threshold, such as 600 metres, then you lose that nuance of 601 metres and the fact that nearer destinations are more valuable than further destinations. However, if you weight destinations by their distance and extend that catchment out much further, then you're more likely to have a more realistic representation of the walking and cycling thresholds. And you can get that sort of data from something like in Melbourne, a VISTA survey, Victorian Integrated Survey of Travel and Activity, that tells you the distances that people travel to access for different trip purposes.
Getting back to the, Chris Truman raised the issue of local council's approach, and more generally underlying the question appears to be, is the modelling, does it have a sort of ideal catchment, if you like? Can it be regional, or can it be anything between regional and neighbourhood? And that might sort of help, seem to be another aspect of his question, rather than just do councils use it.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, I mean, we've been talking about this as an urban measure, but accessibility can be done at any scale. So accessibility can be done globally, and you can look at access to airports or access to capital cities around the world, or, if you're a major logistics hub, access to, how many people can you reach within 3 hours by air travel, or how many people can be reached by 14 days by ship. But you can also look at this at a micro scale, and if you think about how is a supermarket laid out, this is one of my favorite examples. So the major colo retailers will typically buy end caps at a supermarket, the things at the end of the aisle, and they'll put Coca-Cola there or Pepsi Cola there. And they're paying the supermarket for the privilege of locating there, so that they'll be in front of the shopper's eyeballs. It's an accessibility measure at the retail level, at the location of a Coca-Cola bottle. And the off brands will be located in the middle of the aisle, which are less accessible and less visible. And, you know, those brands will typically be less expensive on average, but they'll also be less desired because of marketing or brand affinity or whatever. So access can occur at any scale that we're interested in, because we're transport engineers and typically deal in an urban context. We talk about that a lot, but just sort of it's a larger principle.
Okay, moving on. Lindsay Oxlade from Adelaide sort of asked the question, or put the proposition that the concept of accessibility seems to be critical to the development of land use transport integration models from here on. Does the panel have views on how this could best be achieved? I guess, do we have a national standard? Do we have a statewide standard like we do in things like aircraft noise and things like that, where we apply national standards?
Yeah, I'm not convinced of that premise, right? So one of the advantages of access measures is that we don't need to have detailed forecasts of spatial interaction. We do need to know where stuff is. And we need to know where there are houses and where there are office buildings and where there's schools and where there are warehouses. But we don't need to know how they match, and we don't need to know who lives where in the future if we're doing it as a broader accessibility measure. And so one of the reasons that, you know, the utility theory is nice if you have very detailed projections of individual behavior. But the problem is, I know that there's going to be a house where I am now in 20 years, or I have a high confidence there'll be a house where I am in 20 years. But I don't know who's going to live in this house in 20 years. And I don't know what their preferences and behaviors are going to be in 20 years. So the things that we know is where the infrastructure is, because 90-something% of what's going to be there in 10 years is there today. And probably similarly for real estate. And 80-something percent of something that's going to be there in 20 years is there today. But if you want to make, not that you can't use accessibility measures with land use transport interaction models, but the beauty of the accessibility measures is you can do them without the land use transport interaction models. And I think that's an advantage in trying to understand the system, that we've often tried to be very precise about the future in ways that are not at all accurate. And the future, I mean, if you look back at the plans that were done 30 years ago about today, you can sort of laugh at a lot of the things that they got wrong. And we only need to look at, you know, forecasts for told demand on selected facilities to sort of understand how these models can go wrong. But we also can know that some basic things are still true, and, you know, almost all the buildings that were there 30 years ago are still there, and the buildings, you know, that there'll be some population growth you can sort of project. Anytime you go farther out into the future, it's going to be more problematic. But there's a lot of uncertainty about technological change, about demographic change, about behavioral change. I mean, even all the forecasts from 2 years ago are already going to be wrong because of the acceleration of work from home. I mean, this was a slowly increasing trend that had a sharp shock to the system that led to a much larger increase. And, you know, after, it might come down a little bit, but we would expect that in 20 or 30 years, work from home is going to be significantly higher than it was in 2018 or 2019. So I think the less model dependencies you can have, the more robust your planning will be. And that's one of the advantages of the accessibility framework.
Okay. Matthew McKibben raises an interesting question, and picking up on Laura's question about accessibility within business cases. Do we know of any examples of projects or jurisdictions which have in which improved accessibility is monetized and then valued in business cases, perhaps instead of traditional travel time savings?
I guess I'd just build on what David said, because he also mentioned that standards may not be the way to go with access, because access has a really broad application for understanding trends and identifying, differing levels of accessibility. If we do want to use it to make decisions, to actually quantify project wider economic benefits, well, I guess my experience of that has been that it has to be recognised in the framework for making these decisions. But there are other stages of the decision-making process, such as the early options development and prioritisation, that can certainly use access without the need for standardisation. But when it comes to the crunch of putting in proposals to Treasury, there does need to be some authority that is sort of stipulating that this is an acceptable way of quantifying benefits and costs.
And my review of Treasury guidance in New South Wales is that it's acceptable, but the transport agencies are reluctant to use it because they're very much comfortable with travel time savings. And one of the things you need to keep in mind is that the real estate uplift value of accessibility is very much just the capitalization of the travel time savings. So you have to be careful about double counting. You can't just add these things. But in some ways, you have a better estimate of future real estate values than you do of future travel time savings. And if you look at the history of travel time savings projections, it's not a very good reflection of the transport consultant community either. I just did an analysis with a student, Yadi Wang, of the 2nd Avenue subway in New York, which is one of the most expensive infrastructure projects in North America, at least. And it's a new subway line that has been planned since the 1920s. They finally opened the first section of it. They had made forecasts of the travel time savings and used that to justify the benefit cost analysis in the what we would call the business case in Australia. Back when they did the planning for it in the late 1990s, they built it. We've measured the travel time savings and they're not there. On the other hand, we've measured the real estate uplift and it is there. And so from a travel time savings perspective, the ex post analysis would say you shouldn't have built the line. But from a real estate perspective, the ex post analysis, the accessibility analysis essentially says that the line was really valuable. So people are paying a premium for this transport service, not because of the time saved per se, but because of other qualities that it has: reliability, comfort, convenience. It's new, so it's higher quality than the alternative, and so on. But a subway is going to take longer to reach in minutes than a bus stop is typically, because you have to descend down and then descend up, and the stations are going to be less frequent, so your travel times are not actually going to be saved very much. So I think we've gotten ourselves into this, and we forecast our travel time savings, and we never do after the fact analyses of how accurate our study. I mean, I'll say we rarely do them. And the reason we rarely do them is because when we do them, it doesn't look very good. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. It's 20 years later, 30 years later, the world has changed. Conditions that we assumed to be there weren't there. But all of that tells you there's so much uncertainty. Maybe we shouldn't be engaging in that highly uncertain proposition to begin with.
Just swinging, Nguyen Phang has raised the question of what are the impact of autonomous vehicles on accessibility, and does that affect, well, I don't know, how would you model that in?
So there's a few different things that go with autonomy. One is, are autonomous vehicles faster, or is a network with all autonomous vehicles less congested, in which case you adjust the travel times to account for those things. On the other hand, if vehicles are autonomous, maybe we travel farther distances because we can do other things while traveling. So that might change what our travel time thresholds should be that we prefer to look at. But then you get to the question of, our autonomous vehicles things that we own and just replace existing cars, or are they shared vehicles like Ubers that happen to be driven autonomously at a much lower cost than a taxi or a shared ride would be today. And in that case, we have a different kind of travel time structure, because you, instead of the car being immediately available, you have to wait for it to show up in front of your house. And then if you get to the case of shared rides, which given COVID, I'm extremely doubtful of people sharing rides in the future. But then you would be going out of your way to pick up somebody else potentially and waiting for that. So your travel time might be somewhat longer, and that would have to be factored into the analysis. But then you start looking at a full cost analysis, and when people's behavior versus what the full cost of the system are different things, right? So once I've paid for a car, the marginal cost of an individual trip is pretty low, whereas the marginal cost of a taxi trip is pretty high because I haven't paid for the cost of the taxi to begin with. And so how we look at the travel might also change. So it really depends on how autonomous vehicles play out as a technology, whether they get deployed as a replacement for cars, which is what I think is most likely, or they change how we use automobiles in a significant way and essentially become shared autonomous vehicles as the dominant form, in which case that's got more significant changes in the cost structure and the behavioral structure that comes with it.
Okay, one of the other, the next question, sorry, something popped up on the screen while I was just trying to read the next question. What types of inputs and adjustments can be made to your access measurements to account for, well, it says uncomfortable or taxing travel methods. So it's getting at sort of travel and just the general amenity of the vehicles, plus perhaps imperfectly maintained infrastructure. So how do you build that into?
Yeah, so that's a good question. You're getting to some of the challenges at actually operationalizing things, right? So normally we think of a minute as a minute, but then you might ask, well, how do people perceive time? And so my perception of time varies by the mode that I'm taking. And if I'm less comfortable, I perceive time as taking longer. And so we get to sort of, if I'm walking in a pleasant environment, my estimate of time is, let's imagine that's pretty close to accurate. And if I'm walking in an environment where I feel uncomfortable, you know, I'm walking next to parking lots with broken glass bottles, and the sidewalks, the footpaths are not properly maintained, and there's nobody else around except some creepy people, then I might think that time is much longer. And so in that environment, my perceived 30 minutes is actually 20 minutes or something like that, in which case my accessibility is lower than it otherwise would be. So that would be one way you might think of it. In the case of bicycles, what we do look at is bicycling anywhere bicycles are allowed versus bicycling on what's sometimes called a low stress bicycle network. And a low stress network is where the daily traffic is really low, so like neighborhood streets, or where bike lanes are separated and protected. And that's a reduced network compared to anywhere bicyclists may go. And as a result, the shortest path on that network is longer than the shortest path on the other network. And that reduces the accessibility that's available to you. You could try to come up with other qualitative measures, other types of multipliers based on quality. People are looking at upgrades and downgrade, going uphill and downhill as another way of making travel time adjustments to account for energy and effort use. So there's different ways of looking at it. There's not a single comprehensive way of doing it yet, but the problem is every time you start to introduce these complexities, well, the complexities also exist in public transport. They exist in driving, and people's driving times perceived driving times vary significantly from their actual driving times. And so we start looking at perceived times versus objective times, we've exploded the complexity of the problem.
That was explained really nicely about how you weight people's perception of time or people weight their own perception of time. And in a perfect world where we could collect all the data we wanted, we'd actually be able to work out what that perception of time was for people in a particular situation, for different modes. But in reality, we don't necessarily have access to that data. But as David alluded to, there are some attributes of, for example, a walking and cycling network that we know make it more favourable, make it a low stress environment. Or in the case of walkers, pedestrians, there's the pedestrian level of service is sort of a phrase that is coming to be used for how friendly an environment is for walkers. Now, for Sasha's benefit, there's actually a tool that's been developed in the UK called the Propensity to Cycle tool. And if you want to go on and refresh some of the things that David just mentioned about what constitutes a low stress cycling environment, you can Google this Propensity to Cycle tool, and it talks about how they arrived at some of the assumptions about what constitutes a friendly cycling network, and that might help you implement that in what you're doing, because I guess I recognize that in a perfect world we can't actually gather all the data we need to work out what the relative cost of time is, and that's where, as I mentioned in my presentation, we need to make some assumptions and apply some weights, and there's a bit of judgment that's needed in that.
One last question. I'm conscious of the time. I think we've only got 3 minutes left. How to use accessibility measures to address social isolation? And I think may have touched on it a little bit, but social rather than physical isolation, so that it's, I think, is the thrust of that question.
So, I mean, as Laura showed in one of the graphs, people have been using accessibility to measure social isolation, and I guess identifying the problem is sort of the first step in solving it. How you solve social isolation, how you bring people together who are socially isolated is much more of a social welfare type of function than a transport engineering type of function. But we can measure the, people who are less likely to have daily interactions with other people. And obviously we've worsened it with lockdowns and all the kinds of social distancing measures that we've engaged in the last couple of years. And so the question is, we're at attention, right? Do we want access to other people? Yes, but then there's this disamenity, this cost associated with access to other people, which is some probability of acquiring a dread disease. And that's the balancing act that we have, sort of the tension of the access to all the good things that being near other people are enable versus the access to all of the bad things that are associated with all of those other people. There's not a clear answer, I don't think, about how we use access to enable a reduction of social isolation, but maybe Laura has other ideas. But I think it's very useful for diagnostics.
I would just agree with that. I think you have to, you can't address what you don't measure. So I guess having a view of where those pockets of isolation are is the first step for being able to do something.
As I think someone said, everything is related to everything else, and it's not easy, and it is complex. With just 1 minute to go, I'll draw these proceedings to close and to thank our speakers for their patient and well-informed presentations. And just to remind people to keep an eye on the ITE breaking news and web page for some upcoming seminars. The team has got a whole lot of very interesting topics that are sort of in almost the final stages of preparation. So we hope to see you at our next event in the next coming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
And stay safe.